This is Yes Presents Rising Up with Sonali, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar, Senior Editor at Yes Media. You can find this program at yesmagazine.org, watch it on Free Speech TV, and listen to it on community and independent radio stations nationwide. Donald Trump is enacting his campaign promise of slapping tariffs on goods imported from Canada, Mexico, and China. Reuters explained how his actions have, quote, spooked investors with fears of an economic downturn driving a stock market sell-off that has wiped out $4 trillion from the S&P 500's peak last month when Wall Street was cheering much of Trump's agenda, end of quote. And while liberal critics are blaming Trump for upending the economy, some on the left are reminding us that tariffs can be a force for good if done correctly. Among them is Hillary Haden, longtime advocate of a just and sustainable global economy. She's the former executive director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition and the current organizing director at the Trade Justice Education Fund. Welcome to the program, Hillary.
Thank you so much, Sonali. Thank you for having me.
Well, I came across your story that you wrote, an op-ed that you wrote in The Call, called Why the Left Needs Tariffs in Its Economic Toolbox. And I was really glad to see that because I remember 1999. I remember when tens of thousands of Americans, Canadians, workers, unionists, environmentalists joined forces to march on Seattle when the World Trade Organization met and thought of tariffs in a very different way than I think some on the left are now. So first, let's start at the basics in the beginning because it can be wonky. Explain in clear language, like you do in your story, what tariffs are and what it is that Trump is trying to do.
Yeah, so I'll say quickly that when I wrote this piece, I really was trying to get the left to not lose sight of the bigger picture, right? Of the economy that we want to see, the economy that we want to create, just out of a desire to simply oppose things, right, that Trump does. There are a lot of lies around right now about tariffs. A thing that folks are hearing over and over is really that these tariffs are about fentanyl and immigration. And something that I hope your viewers know, and if they don't, I'm happy to share with them that the president can't unilaterally impose tariffs without Congress unless there's a national emergency, right? So in that case, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, the president can impose tariffs on their own. So that's why you're seeing all this bluster, right, about there being this big national emergency. Because if he doesn't have that, he can't impose tariffs, right? Themselves are a tool. They are a tax, essentially, that are slapped on goods that are imported into this country. Something that the Trump administration wants everyone here to believe is that those tariffs are being paid, right, by Canada, by Mexico, by China, by the EU, by the countries that we're importing those goods from. That's false, right? The tariffs are actually being paid by the importer in the United States. The tariffs are being paid, right, by the importer in the United States, not by other countries.
Mm-hmm.
So the claim that Canada, Mexico, the EU are going to pay the tariffs is false. The idea that we have some way to tax citizens of a different country is false. And then we've seen over the last few months this whole ecosystem of lies, right, built around that premise. The idea that we're going to create an external revenue service, the idea that tariffs are going to somehow replace income taxes, right? All of these supposed programs are attempts to give credence to that idea that other countries are paying the tariffs and they're not. The importer is the one that's paying it. But I think
which of course means that American importers, U.S. importers, are going to see the cost to them of relying on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China go up significantly.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? And I think one thing that I see the news covering in a way that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable is that it's not 100% sure in every circumstance that that cost is going to get passed on to the consumer, right? There's a study of the tariffs done in Trump's first term. In many cases, the cost of the tariff was eaten by the company. And that's kind of a complicated economic equation on whether or not they decide to pass it on, right? But yes, it's U.S. companies that are going to be paying those tariffs. And in certain cases, right, that is going to get passed on to the consumer.
All right. So why is removal of tariff, why is tariff-free trade or free trade in general Not necessarily a great thing. We have Democrats basically convincing us that the neoliberal economic model of free trade is what's going to serve all Americans best. And now, bizarrely, you have the GOP lining up behind a president who is, I don't know what his philosophy is exactly, but basically it's figuring out a way to get enough people to support him and to enrich himself personally, perhaps. So what can tariffs actually help achieve? Right now, people can, for example, buy things on Amazon from China that are insanely cheap, right? Like really, really cheap, far cheaper than you would ever imagine that it would be to produce something like that in the United States. And while that's great for our bottom line, it's not necessarily great as a whole for the environment, certainly not for Chinese labor. It's great
Right.
for us, maybe as consumers, and maybe it's great for the corporations who are sucking up profits in between. So how should we think about tariffs?
Yeah, so um, I think that we need to think about tariffs again as a tool, right? It's not an overarching economic strategy. It's not a thing that we pursue just on its own for its own sake, right? But if you want to um, prioritize goods that are made in a certain labor rights environment, as you're describing with China, right? For certain labor rights violations, there are moments when we've worked on labor issues in Mexico, labor issues in the Philippines, that kind of thing. If we want to address labor rights, tariffs are a tool that can do that. If we want to push forward on a green economy, right? If we want to do our own, green manufacturing sector, tariffs can help us with that, right? Tariffs can help us prioritize buy local, buy American type programs that really help put money, into our own local economy. And I will say, we could also allow other countries to do the exact same thing instead of fighting them on those policies at the WTO, right? These are the strategies that we've seen over the past like 30-ish years. I do think that folks need to call out, right? Rightly. They should call out the exploitative, racist ways that we're seeing Trump use tariffs, right? Trump does not differentiate between a good that's coming in from Canada under, from a union factory or union manufacturing space, right? Versus a good that is maybe coming in from somewhere that has less labor rights, right? Has fewer labor rights. And so for him, any good that's foreign is automatically bad, right? We want to see a little bit more of a strategic approach applied here. Um, and again, I really intended for the piece that I wrote to be a conversation starter, right? These are things I think about every day at my job, but they're not the only things, right? And so I'm also hoping to invite people to think a little bit more about what other ways tariffs can be applied, in a
Well,
way that's helpful for goals that we have, right?
I mentioned the 1999 World Trade Organization,
Mhm.
the anti-WTO movement, right? It was called the
Mhm.
anti-globalization movement in the late 90s. So much momentum built up, and it was kind of remarkable that people felt so and were so educated on kind of a complicated topic that we're often told we is too complicated for us to understand. People
Right.
were excited. They were very, very militant. And a lot of that, of course, got derailed when the September 11th attacks happened in 2001. And then we just haven't
Mhm.
seen a revival of those conversations. What was the left saying about tariffs in the late 90s that we can still sort of remind ourselves is applicable, especially considering how much further our climate crisis, for example, has gone?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, and I will say that in my role at the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, I was responsible for organizing a 20th anniversary in 2019, to bring some of those partners back together, to have some of these conversations and also update them in certain ways, right? We're talking about a world now where all of us have internet, right? Which was not necessarily the case in 99, that everyone was a given that everyone had internet, that kind of thing. So. I think the biggest thing that folks then were talking about, and there's great visuals, right, of Teamsters, turtles, folks in the streets and all kinds of fun stuff. But I think one thing that people were really talking about at the time is they were afraid that lowering all of our tariffs to zero, going into the WTO, was really going to impact jobs, right? It was really going to impact the number of jobs in the economy, where those jobs were, how much people were getting paid, and what the floor for those jobs was going to be, was were the standards going to be that it was union jobs, right? That people got paid a good wage, that there were good work safety standards, those kinds of things. Or were we going to see a race to the bottom for wages and working standards across the world as businesses were able to move around the globe, right, to find the most easily exploitable community to put their factory down in, right? And I think the jobs angle is something that again we're hearing now, right? We're hearing Trump say that this is all about jobs. And I'll say that there are moments when tariffs are about jobs, right? We want to see tariffs applied in a way where there's a tariff that's coming around to protect some sort of industry, but there's also a domestic investment, right? We're watching Trump try to claw back investments, right? The CHIPS Act put a lot of money into the economy for research, for development, for factories, for manufacturing, for chips, right? The same thing is true of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think there are folks on the left that are critical of those pieces of legislation, but they look like an industrial policy, right? An attempt at industrial policy. Trump's doing tariffs, but then clawing all those investments for research, for factories, for workers and communities that were going to benefit from that legislation back out of the economy, right? And so that's, again, I guess to your question about what we want to see is really we want to see a strategy that puts the domestic investment that we need to succeed in those areas, right? And then puts the tariff around to protect that thing.
Right. I mean, he and the GOP have often talked about bringing American jobs back. And if they did tariffs right, or if anyone did tariffs right, Democrats or Republicans, they could actually do that, right?
Of course.
In a
Yeah.
humane way without undercutting people. And I mean, it could be done correctly. There's a way to do it so that tariffs can be, as you said, a tool in the right hands.
Yeah.
It's not a policy, which is also something that's worth reminding ourselves of.
I think the really complicated thing too, as we've entered into all these trade agreements, is really that like supply chains are super integrated now, right? So a car, for example, moves back and forth across all three borders in North, or all two borders, I guess, between the three countries, right? Canada, Mexico, and the United States many times while it's being manufactured. And so it's really difficult, um, especially with like our closest trading partners, right, to imagine how these tariffs could be done. But again, when we think about it, we're thinking about a surgical approach. How do you apply a tariff to goods from a specific factory, right, that is going after its workers that are trying to unionize, those kinds of things, right? Really specific, really strategic, surgical. Surgical is the word I would use.
Right. Meanwhile, you have Democrats sort of, I think, fooling many on the left to think that, oh, Trump's tariffs are, Trump is destroying the economy by slapping these tariffs, and we inadvertently become champions of a free trade economy and inadvertently become champions of Wall Street and the stock market, holding profits supreme over everything and any other consideration. But all of those invisible costs to people and the planet are basically us giving them away, right, to corporate profiteering when we don't enact some kind of cost for them. And that can be enacted through tariffs if done right. Hillary, where can people find out about the work you do? Where can they sort of educate themselves? Because, as I said, this was a big deal in the late 90s on the left, and it just isn't anymore. But it can be, right? Yeah. It can be. Like, we can use Trump's position to revive these discussions and critique the capitalist system, because people are still, and perhaps more so now, critical of capitalism. Young people in particular are extremely critical of capitalism because it hasn't benefited them. So it's a good time.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Exactly as you're saying, it's been really difficult to watch certain narratives coming from this administration. And it almost feels like people get reflexively tricked right into defending free trade in some way. Reciprocal tariffs are the perfect picture of that, right? Where they're saying other countries have a tariff, so we're going to match their tariff. And then somehow that's going to make us both lower our tariffs is exactly a free trade narrative, right? So the best place that folks can go to learn more about the work that we do is the Trade Justice Education Fund, tradejusticeedfund.org. We've also worked really closely, right, with the Rethink Trade division at the American Economic Liberties Project, which has tons of excellent fact sheets and information.